This is a mistake. I am innocent.
If the system can so easily bury an innocent man, how many more truths are still locked away, waiting for someone brave enough to press play? And if a judge can be bought and an innocent man caged while the guilty sip champagne, what does that say about the world we live in, and what are we willing to risk to change it? On that fateful day, the gavel struck like a gunshot. In the matter of the state versus Jamal Rhodes, I hereby sentence the defendant to 25 years in federal prison. A cold silence fell over the courtroom. His mother let out a low, guttural cry, the kind that breaks from the soul, not the throat. His younger brother, Andre, grabbed the wooden bench in front of him so hard his knuckles turned white. Their father stood frozen, as if the very ground beneath his feet had betrayed him. But Jamal, 29 years old, clean record, former youth pastor, community mentor, father of two, just blinked. Slowly, quietly, like he couldn't believe this was real. His hands were already cuffed, his brown skin gleaming with sweat under the courtroom lights. The judge, Harold Whitmore, white, polished, stern, didn't look at him once after delivering the sentence. He adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, gave a brief nod to the court clerk, and stood to leave. Jamal tried to speak, but the bailiff shoved him forward. "No, wait," his mother shouted, rising from the pew. "My son didn't do this. You know he didn't do this." The judge paused, just for a moment, and then walked out. Andre felt his heart pounding in his ears. He turned to his father, a man who rarely cried, but now looked as though he might crumble where he stood. "This doesn't make sense," Andre whispered. "There was no evidence. No motive. No, nothing." "I know," his father said. "That's what makes it worse." 3 months earlier, Jamal Rhodes had been arrested at his apartment in South Heights, a mostly black neighborhood known more for its working-class pride than for crime. The charge? Aggravated robbery and assault. The alleged victim? A wealthy businessman named Charles Denmore, heir to the Denmore real estate fortune and owner of over 50 properties across the city. The problem? Jamal didn't know the man. Had never been near the man's home. There was no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, no recovered items, just a shaky eyewitness statement and a mysteriously missing street camera recording. Yet somehow, that was enough. Judge Harold Whitmore, known for his tough on crime rulings and strong political backing from the city's elite, had denied every motion from Jamal's public defender. Requests to introduce character witnesses, denied. Request to subpoena Charles Denmore's private security footage, denied. Request for a mistrial after a juror was overheard referring to Jamal as one of those gang types, also denied. Now Jamal sat behind bulletproof glass in a detention cell, trying to breathe in a world that no longer made sense. Meanwhile, in the quiet glass offices of Denmore and Associates, a storm was brewing. Lydia Palmer, Charles Denmore's executive assistant, sat at her desk, staring at her locked phone screen. Her stomach twisted. Her hands trembled. The voice memo app taunted her silently. She had made the recording 3 weeks ago. She hadn't meant to. Not at first. But when Charles asked her to stay late that night, told her to print out envelopes, burner account details, and sign off on some strange cash transfers, something in her gut told her to hit record. What she captured was damning. On tape, Charles's voice was cold and calculated. "I don't care who they pin it on as long as it sticks. That judge'll take care of it, just like before." The pause. Then a soft laugh. "Whitmore's hungry. Always is. He'll get his cut. That poor bastard'll never know what hit him." Lydia hadn't told anyone. Not even her sister. Not her boyfriend. Not HR. Because she knew what Charles Denmore could do. He owned buildings, judges, media stations. She'd once watched him fire a woman for misspelling his name in an email. That same woman lost her apartment 2 weeks later, a Denmore-owned property. Now Jamal Rhodes, some man she'd never met, whose name only surfaced through whispers in the office, was sitting in a cell, condemned for a crime that was bought and sold behind closed doors. And Lydia? Lydia had the truth. But truth she knew could get you killed. Back in South Heights, Andre sat in his room, the the glow of his cracked laptop screen reflecting off his face. He hadn't slept. Not since the sentencing. He was only 22, but he had inherited Jamal's stubbornness and their mother's sense of justice. He had been studying tech engineering at the local community college before dropping out to work construction after their father's stroke. But he hadn't lost his knack for digital things. And he was determined to find out what they weren't being told. He pulled up every news article, legal blog, and public court document he could get his hands on. Denmore's name came up again and again. Donations to the mayor's campaign, real estate fraud allegations that mysteriously vanished, a federal housing probe that went nowhere. But Judge Whitmore? He was harder to pin. Until Andre found a grainy photo buried deep on a public event archive. A charity gala. Black ties and champagne. And there, in the corner, Charles Denmore, laughing beside Judge Whitmore. The two men shaking hands. A quiet caption beneath. Keynote donors for the City Integrity Project, Integrity. The word made Andre sick. The next morning, Lydia walked into her office with a decision made. She pulled the flash drive from her purse. Transferred the voice recording. Wrote a short note, not signed, not traceable, and stuffed both into a manila envelope. She printed Jamal Rhodes's case number on the front. Then the address of the courthouse. And finally, she added the words, "For the eyes of justice only." The envelope arrived 2 days later. Clerk's office. Anonymous delivery. Left at the mail desk. No one noticed it at first, until a janitor cleaning the judge's chambers accidentally knocked it off a counter and it slid open. The flash drive clattered across the floor. 3 hours later, Judge Whitmore sat in his courtroom preparing to sentence a new defendant when a loud beep echoed through the chamber. A TV monitor flickered to life. Audio poured from the speakers. "I don't care who they pin it on as long as it sticks." Gasps erupted. "That judge'll take care of it, just like before." The judge's face turned ghostly pale. Court officers stood frozen. The stenographer's hands hovered midair. Jamal Rhodes's lawyer, sitting quietly in the gallery reviewing appeal forms, looked up, eyes wide. "Whitmore's hungry. Always is. He'll get his cut. That poor bastard'll never know what hit him." Every head turned toward the bench. Whitmore didn't speak. But he knew. It was over. The courtroom didn't breathe. Judge Whitmore sat frozen, his jaw clenched, eyes scanning the room as though searching for a reset button on reality. But there was no escape. Not this time. The voice on the speaker had betrayed him, not just as a man but as a symbol. A symbol of justice turned merchant, a gatekeeper of the law who had sold his conscience to the highest bidder. And now, his sins echoed through the courtroom walls for all to hear. The voice faded. Silence returned, but it was louder than before. A murmur rolled across the gallery like a wave, slow at first, then erupting into gasps, whispers, and audible outrage. People weren't just shocked, they were furious, not only at Whitmore but at the idea that something like this could have happened right in front of their eyes. Lydia Palmer wasn't in the room. But if she had been, she would have seen it, the unraveling of a carefully constructed illusion. The man she worked for, the judge he bought, the lie they both lived, it had all just collapsed like a house of cards soaked in gasoline. And in the center of it all, Jamal Rhodes sat in his orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed, eyes wide, watching the world shift. The following morning, the city woke up to chaos. Every news outlet carried the same headline, bold and damning. Judge Whitmore implicated in bribery scheme, secret recording revealed in court. Clips of the audio leaked online within hours. Social media exploded with fury. Protesters began gathering outside the courthouse before noon. Signs waved in the air, chants grew louder, and every face in the crowd carried the same demand. Justice, not for one man, but for the system that let this happen. Inside the family home of the Rhodeses, Andre sat with trembling fingers, scrolling through his phone, refreshing his feed every few seconds. His mother paced the living room, phone pressed to her ear as she spoke to their lawyer. Their father sat silently by the window, staring out as if he might see his son walking home any second now. Jamal wasn't home. Not yet. The charges hadn't been dropped. The wheels of justice don't spin in reverse that easily, not even when caught in the act. The DA had issued a statement saying they were reviewing new evidence and would act accordingly. But Andre didn't want words. He wanted results. He stood up, grabbed his laptop, and walked into Jamal's old bedroom. The posters on the walls were still there. Miles Davis, Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X. Reminders of the man whose freedom had been stolen. He opened a new document and began typing, assembling everything he had. Timestamps, images, data from Denmore's corporate donations, photos of Whitmore at Denmore's fundraisers, anything that painted the picture that the system refused to see. He would make them see. 2 miles across town, in a high-rise office with floor-to-ceiling windows, Lydia Palmer sat at her desk staring at the text message on her phone. "We need to talk. Now." It was from Charles. She didn't reply. She stood, quietly walked to the break room, and poured herself a cup of coffee she had no intention of drinking. Her heart was racing, but her mind was calm. She had done the right thing. She had acted in silence, without expectation of praise or protection. And now, she could feel the consequences hunting her. Her desk phone rang. She ignored it. Her cell rang next. Same number. Still ignored. Finally, an email pinged her inbox. The subject line read, "Urgent, contract review meeting at 3 p.m. She laughed softly, shaking her head. She knew what this was. There would be no contract meeting. No HR rep. Just Charles Denmore, alone in his glass tower, waiting to remind her that he never loses. But this time he already had. At 2:58 p.m., Lydia stepped into the elevator. She wore all black, not as a statement, but because she felt like someone in mourning, not for herself, but for the version of Charles Denmore she once believed in. The top floor was quiet. Too quiet. She knocked once, then pushed open the door. Charles stood behind his desk, arms folded, his face composed but his eyes bloodshot. "You sent it?" he said. She didn't answer. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked, voice low and venomous. "I told the truth," she replied. He laughed, short and cold. "You think truth matters? Look outside, Lydia. That crowd? That noise? They'll forget in a week. They always do." She stared at him, unblinking. Not this time. He walked toward her slowly, like a man who still believed in his own invincibility. "You're finished. I'll bury you in paperwork, lawsuits, I'll freeze your accounts, blacklist you from every job in this city." "I don't work for you anymore," she interrupted. Her voice didn't waver. A flicker of something passed through his eyes. Maybe rage, maybe disbelief. Maybe, just maybe, fear. "You just destroyed everything we built," he said. "No," Lydia replied. "You did that the moment you sold a man's life for a bribe." Meanwhile, Jamal sat in his cell with a Bible in his lap, the only thing they hadn't taken from him. He didn't read. He just held it, staring at the thin paper, letting its weight ground him. A guard approached the door. "Rhodes," he said. "You got a visitor." Jamal looked up, confused. "Who?" The door buzzed, then opened. Andre stepped in, followed by a tall man in a gray suit, one of the new attorneys from the civil rights group that had offered to take Jamal's case pro bono after the recording surfaced. They sat down, and for the first time in months, Jamal heard the words he'd been praying for. "They're filing a motion to vacate," the lawyer said. "You're coming home." Jamal didn't move. For a second, it didn't register. Then, slowly, his eyes began to water. His throat clenched. Andre leaned forward and grabbed his brother's hand. They couldn't keep the truth buried forever, man. "You're coming home." But outside those prison walls, the storm was just beginning. Judge Whitmore had been placed on administrative leave. An internal investigation had begun, but no formal charges were filed yet. The prosecutor's office tried to play damage control, insisting they'd been unaware of any misconduct. Charles Denmore issued a public statement denying all involvement, calling the audio deepfake technology and accusing political enemies of smearing a successful entrepreneur. But the people weren't buying it. Protesters now surrounded Denmore and associates. Civil rights groups were demanding the resignation of every official who played a role in Jamal's conviction. And Lydia Palmer? She finally spoke. In a live interview on public radio, she told her story, calmly, truthfully, without fear. I did what I did because I couldn't live with the weight of someone else's suffering on my conscience, she said. I believe we're all accountable, even when the law looks the other way. Her words rippled through the city like aftershocks, cracking the foundation of every lie that had held power in place for too long. The cell door creaked open slowly, but Jamal didn't stand up. Not right away. He had imagined this moment countless times, walking out, seeing the sky without bars, feeling the wind on his face without chains on his wrists, but now that it was here, he hesitated, not because he didn't want to leave, but because part of him didn't believe he was allowed. The prison officer nodded toward the hallway, his voice unusually gentle, as if he knew he was witnessing something sacred. Come on, Rhodes. Time to go home. Jamal rose from the metal bench and stepped forward, chains clinking with every movement until the officer knelt and unlocked them. As the shackles fell to the floor with a soft clang, a strange silence settled over the room, not of emptiness, but of release. The weight of injustice, at least for this moment, was peeling away from his body. Andre was waiting in the prison parking lot, eyes darting between his brother and the large iron gates that separated them. When Jamal walked through, Andre didn't say a word. He just opened his arms and pulled his older brother in, holding him as if to make up for every second they'd lost behind those walls. Their mother stood nearby, hands pressed to her lips, weeping so openly that strangers passing by stopped to look. But she didn't care. Her son was free. That was the only truth that mattered. Back at home, the walls felt smaller, tighter, as if the house had held its breath for 3 months and was only now exhaling. The living room still had the dent in the couch where Jamal used to sit reading scripture or helping Andre fix his resume. The small crack in the hallway mirror was still there, caused by a football they had tossed inside years ago, even after their mother told them not to. The scent of her oxtail stew filled the air, familiar and comforting, like a hug from the past. But Jamal couldn't settle in. He walked slowly through the house, running his fingers along the walls, touching framed pictures with cautious reverence. His daughter's drawings still hung on the fridge, stick figures with smiling faces, one of them labeled Daddy. His heart clenched. He had missed her 6th birthday. He sat on the edge of his bed and closed his eyes, trying to catch his breath. But all he saw was the courtroom, the judge, the sentence, the bailiff's hand on his shoulder, the stunned silence. And now, the questions. So many questions. Why so easy? Why didn't anyone in that courtroom, not even the jury, see what was obvious? He gritted his teeth, not from anger alone, but from grief. Grief for the man he used to be, trusting, hopeful, obedient to a justice system that never intended to protect him. 2 days later, Lydia Palmer sat alone in her apartment, curtains drawn, TV muted, her inbox flooded with emails from reporters, lawyers, angry trolls, and a few strangers calling her a hero. But she didn't feel like one. She had risked everything. Her job, her safety, her future. She had told the truth, yes, but now she was unemployed, under threat, and unsure of what came next. That morning, she had walked into her neighborhood grocery store, only to find a laminated flyer with her photo plastered near the entrance. This woman is a liar. Don't trust her. No name. No number. Just a warning. She had seen it in the eyes of the man behind the register. He recognized her. But he said nothing. He rang up her items silently, handed her the receipt without eye contact. The truth, she was learning, doesn't always buy you peace. Sometimes it buys you exile. That night, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror and looked at herself differently, not with shame, but with weariness. Her spine was straighter than it had been in months, but her face looked older. Her conscience was clear, but her heart was tired. How many people out there, she wondered, had stayed silent because they couldn't afford to be brave? Meanwhile, Charles Denmore was on the offensive. He stood behind a polished mahogany podium at a press conference arranged by his legal team. Reporters were gathered in front of him like vultures, but Denmore still wore that same smug grin, the same designer suit, the same thinly veiled arrogance of a man who had always gotten away with it. This entire incident, he said, gripping the podium tightly, is a coordinated smear campaign. The audio is fake, manipulated, Deepfakes are becoming increasingly common, and this is clearly politically motivated. My legal team has already submitted evidence proving my innocence, and I will be pursuing civil action against those responsible. The reporters threw questions at him about his ties to Judge Whitmore, about his past campaign donations, about Lydia Palmer's statements, but he deflected each one, dripping in corporate confidence. I have built housing for thousands. I have donated to schools, hospitals, shelters. I have been a pillar of this community, and I will not let baseless accusations ruin that. He walked off the stage without answering the last question, his lawyers trailing behind him like shadows. That night, a new video surfaced on a small independent journalism channel. It was grainy, but clear enough. Charles Denmore, sitting at a restaurant 2 years ago with Judge Whitmore. They weren't just shaking hands. They were exchanging envelopes. The video went viral within hours. The public mood shifted again, this time boiling with anger. Hashtags exploded across social media. Hashtag Free Jamal, hashtag Charge Whitmore, hashtag Denmore Exposed. But still, no arrests. No charges. Just investigations and silence. Jamal watched the video on his brother's laptop, then turned it off. His stomach twisted, not just from anger, but from the realization that freedom wasn't the same as justice. They still walking free, he said quietly. Still sleeping in their beds like nothing happened. Andre nodded slowly, sitting next to him. We can't make em care, Andre replied, but we can make em afraid. We shine enough light on their darkness, they gonna run out of places to hide. Jamal looked at him, then at the closed door down the hall where his daughter was sleeping. I don't want revenge, he said. I want truth to mean something again. The next morning, civil rights attorneys representing Jamal filed a federal civil suit not just against Whitmore and Denmore, but against the state for wrongful conviction, emotional trauma, and malicious prosecution. But Jamal didn't want money. He wanted accountability. He agreed to speak at a community town hall, televised locally, streamed online. Standing at the podium, dressed in a plain gray button-up, he didn't shout or curse. He just told his story. I didn't grow up thinking the system hated me, he said. But I learned. The hard way. I lost 3 months of my life. My daughter cried herself to sleep every night. My mother nearly had a stroke. And for what? So a rich man could protect his empire. He paused, letting the silence speak. This ain't just about me. This is about every man, every woman, every kid they lock up and throw away because somebody richer needed a favor. It stops here. The room erupted in applause, some people crying, others clapping so hard their hands turned red. But Jamal just stepped down quietly, his eyes filled not with pride, but with resolve. The day Judge Harold Whitmore was arrested, the sky was overcast, and the air carried a strange quiet, like the city itself was holding its breath. It happened just before sunrise. No cameras. No reporters. No grand announcement. Just 2 unmarked vehicles, 4 plainclothes federal agents, and a quiet knock on the door of a gated brick colonial in Crestmont, the neighborhood where old money slept peacefully and dirty secrets stayed buried. Whitmore answered the door in a silk robe, confusion briefly flickering across his face before his eyes caught the badges. His mouth opened, as if to speak, maybe even plead, but the lead agent cut him off. Judge Harold Whitmore, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of judicial power. The words struck like bullets. Whitmore didn't resist. He didn't protest. His hands trembled as he held them out for the cuffs, the polished silver glinting under the porch light like mockery. As he was led away, neighbors peeked from behind their curtains, gasping, murmuring, whispering to one another that perhaps he wasn't who they thought he was after all. But the truth was, he had always been exactly who he was. The only difference now was that someone had finally pulled the curtain back. The news broke within hours. Breaking: Judge Whitmore in federal custody after bribery scandal uncovered. Headlines plastered every screen, flooded every timeline, and echoed across every station. His mugshot, once a face of law and order, now carried the blank, stunned expression of a man who had fallen off a pedestal he built himself. People in the streets cheered. Protesters outside the courthouse lifted their signs higher. "We told you so," and "No justice, no peace," screamed from cardboard and marker. But behind the public celebration was a deeper wound, one that no arrest could easily stitch back together. Because for every man like Jamal Rhodes, whose story reached the surface, there were dozens more buried in silence, names forgotten, cases closed, lives broken. Jamal watched the coverage from his living room, his daughter asleep on his lap, her small fingers wrapped around his thumb. His eyes never left the screen, but his thoughts were miles away. This wasn't closure. It was a beginning. Lydia Palmer sat across from a federal investigator in a beige conference room, the kind designed to drain all warmth and comfort from the air. A recorder sat between them, blinking red. She had been speaking for over an hour, recounting every detail, dates, names, payments, transfers, conversations she had once buried under the weight of self-preservation. She hadn't slept much since the interview request came. She knew cooperating was the right thing, but every time she thought about it, she also thought about retaliation. Charles Denmore was still free, still powerful, and still angry. "Were there other instances," the agent asked, "where you witnessed similar exchanges between Mr. Denmore and court officials?" Lydia nodded slowly, then looked down at her hands. "Yes," she whispered. "There were more." The room went still. The agent leaned forward. "Names." Lydia hesitated, swallowed hard, then began to speak again, her voice steady but haunted. While the city celebrated Whitmore's downfall, Charles Denmore doubled his security, his lawyers, and his lies. He issued another public statement, calling Whitmore a rogue actor, and claiming he had been duped like everyone else. But people weren't buying it anymore. Independent journalists uncovered emails tying Denmore to political donors connected to multiple judges. Investigative podcasts dissected his real estate empire, revealing shady land deals, fraudulent tax claims, and gentrification tactics that had displaced hundreds. The city was waking up. But Denmore still wasn't in handcuffs. Not yet. Andre walked into the community center with a flash drive and a mission. He had been working day and night compiling every document, every photograph, every financial leak he could find. His room looked like a conspiracy board, strings connecting court cases, donation records, corporate invoices, and names, so many names, of people who had either been silenced or screwed over. Inside the center's auditorium, community leaders had gathered for an emergency town forum. Civil rights lawyers, activists, former inmates, pastors, youth leaders, everyone was there. Andre stepped up to the mic, nerves buzzing under his skin, but voice calm. "I'm not a lawyer," he began. "I'm not a politician, I'm not even a college graduate. But I'm a brother. And I'm a son. And I'm a black man in a country that tried to lock away my family and call it justice." Murmurs filled the room. "I've spent the last 2 months researching not just what happened to Jamal, but how it was allowed to happen. And I want y'all to see what I found." He plugged in the flash drive. The screen lit up. A slideshow began to play. Faces. Documents. Each slide told a story. Each story painted a picture. And by the end, that picture was clear. Whitmore wasn't the only corrupt judge. Denmore wasn't the only man pulling strings. The corruption was layered, systemic, intentional. The room fell silent. And then it erupted. People stood. People wept. People shouted. But most importantly, people organized. They drafted petitions, demanded a full investigation into the city's judiciary, called for mass audits of financial records, and pushed for new oversight committees to review every case that passed through Whitmore's courtroom in the last 15 years. The revolution, quiet at first, had found its voice. Later that night, Jamal sat alone on the porch, looking up at the stars. His daughter had gone to bed after asking, "Are the bad people going away now, Daddy?" He had kissed her forehead and told her yes, even though deep down, he knew the battle wasn't over. Andre stepped out, sitting beside him with a bottle of water in one hand and the night breeze in his face. "You good?" he asked. Jamal didn't answer right away. Then he nodded. "I'm better. Not good. Not yet. But better." Andre leaned back. "You know people look at you different now, right? You're not just a victim. You a voice." Jamal exhaled. I never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted to live. I know. But maybe you were chosen for this. They sat in silence, watching the world move slowly in the dark. A week later, federal agents arrived at Denmore's penthouse with a sealed indictment. He was led out in handcuffs, head lowered, flanked by cameras and chants. The same man who once bought silence was now drowning in noise. And in that moment, the city understood a simple truth. No one is untouchable. The courthouse was quieter now, but the silence didn't bring peace. It brought memory, and memory carried weight. Each corner whispered remnants of battles fought behind polished benches and beneath marble ceilings. Each hallway echoed with the cries of mothers, the pleas of sons, the cold verdicts that tore families apart. The corruption that once flowed unseen like poison through the veins of justice had been exposed, but its residue remained. Jamal Rhodes sat on a wooden bench outside courtroom 3B, fingers interlocked, back straight, eyes steady, his suit plain but clean. It was his first time back inside this building since the day he was sentenced, and the air still felt thick, like it remembered what it had done to him. He hadn't come for revenge. He came for accountability. Today, he was here not as a defendant, not as a victim, but as a witness. The prosecution had asked him to testify in the federal case against Judge Harold Whitmore. A week ago, that would have made him nervous. But today, he felt something different. Not confidence, not anger, something deeper. Purpose. Inside the courtroom, Whitmore sat at the defense table, his tailored suit traded for federal issue beige. The man who once looked down on others from behind a bench now stared forward, eyes sunken, hair grayer than before, the weight of disgrace pressing down on his shoulders like chains he couldn't shake. The prosecutor stood and addressed the jury with a calm, focused tone. This case is not just about bribery. It's about betrayal. A betrayal of public trust, of legal responsibility, of basic human decency. He turned toward Jamal. Mr. Rhodes, please approach the stand. Jamal stood, walked slowly to the witness box, and took his oath. He sat, adjusted the microphone, and took a breath. Tell us, Mr. Rhodes, what was your experience in Judge Whitmore's courtroom? Jamal paused. It felt like walking into a place where the outcome was already written, he said, his voice steady. It didn't matter what the evidence said. Didn't matter what I said. The system had already decided who I was, and who I wasn't allowed to be. And who did they decide you were? A criminal, Jamal replied, without flinching. A threat. Not a man, not a father, not a mentor. Just a number to feed the machine. The jury listened closely. Some scribbled notes. Others simply stared. And what impact did that have on your life? My daughter cried herself to sleep for weeks, Jamal said, his voice softening. My mother stopped eating. My little brother thought he had to become a lawyer overnight just to save me. I was gone for 3 months. But those 3 months felt like a lifetime. They don't just take your freedom. They take your peace, your dignity, your time. He turned and looked directly at Whitmore. And you don't get that time back. Whitmore didn't meet his gaze. Outside the courtroom, Lydia Palmer stood with her arms crossed, waiting to be called. She had already given 2 depositions, hours of interviews, and surrendered her private devices. But nothing had prepared her for this moment, standing in the building where so many lives had been destroyed with a gavel strike. When the bailiff finally called her name, she felt her heart skip. She walked in calmly, dressed in black slacks and a blue blouse, her voice composed, her eyes firm. What was your role at Denmore and Associates? The prosecutor asked. I was the executive assistant to Charles Denmore, she replied. And in that capacity, did you witness any actions that could be considered unethical or illegal? Yes. Please elaborate. She took a breath. I was asked to facilitate a number of untraceable transactions. Cash envelopes, offshore transfers, coded invoices. At the time, I didn't know the full extent, but I knew enough to know it wasn't legitimate. The final straw was when I overheard Mr. Denmore discuss a bribe involving Judge Whitmore and the decision to frame an innocent man. The courtroom stirred. And what did you do? I recorded it, Lydia said, her voice firm. I made a copy, and I sent it anonymously to the court. Why anonymously? Because I was terrified, she said, her voice trembling for the first time. Terrified of what would happen if they found out. I knew what Charles Denmore was capable of. I had seen what he did to people who crossed him. Why speak now? She looked toward Jamal. Because silence is the soil corruption grows in. And I refuse to let fear feed injustice any longer. As Lydia stepped down from the witness stand, the weight in her chest began to lift, slowly but surely. She passed Jamal on the way back to her seat, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. Thank you. You're welcome. That evening, the city buzzed with headlines, interviews, and urgent calls for reform. But behind the noise, in living rooms and kitchens across the neighborhood, families sat quietly, discussing what it all meant. In the Rhodes household, Jamal sat on the floor with his daughter, helping her with a puzzle. She pointed at a missing piece, frustrated. It doesn't fit, she said, her brows furrowed. Sometimes, Jamal said gently, you have to turn it around, look at it from a different angle. She flipped it, slid it in, and smiled when it snapped into place. It fits now. Jamal smiled, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of the system, rigid, indifferent, broken. Thought of how many lives had been forced into places they didn't belong. How many people had been forced into a shape they were never meant to be, just so someone else's version of the puzzle could look complete. He thought of all the voices never heard, all the names never printed in headlines. The boys like him who never made it home. And he knew one thing. The fight wasn't over. Later that week, Lydia received an unexpected envelope in the mail. No name, just an address. Inside was a handwritten note. I don't know how to thank you, but I want you to know, your voice saved mine. If you ever need anything, you have a family here now. J.R. She folded the note, tears prickling her eyes, and tucked it into her journal. Judge Whitmore was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 16 years in federal prison, with no chance of parole. He left the courtroom in silence, the same silence he once forced so many others to endure when he passed judgment from above. Charles Denmore's trial loomed next. His team was already flooding the airwaves with interviews, PR statements, and denial after denial. But the people weren't listening anymore. They were watching. The city had never seen a trial like this. Outside the federal courthouse, crowds gathered behind barricades, holding signs, chanting for justice, waving homemade posters with bold red letters, "No more lies, Denmore must pay, our lives are not for sale." Police officers in riot gear stood watch, scanning the perimeter with stiff gazes, but it was clear, this wasn't just another scandal, it was a reckoning. And in the center of it all, Charles Denmore stood behind a tinted window in the back of a black SUV, watching the people he once ignored, feared, and underestimated. He had always believed himself untouchable. For decades, he played the game with precision, schmoozing judges, bankrolling campaigns, crafting contracts so riddled with loopholes they could slip through a hurricane. He didn't build wealth, he built control, and his empire was cemented in silence, in favors, in people who were too afraid or too poor to fight back. But now, the silence was broken, and the tremble of accountability had reached his doorstep. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Denmore entered, flanked by two attorneys in $1,000 suits. He moved slower than usual, shoulders slightly hunched, but his jaw remained tight, and his expression still carried the smug confidence of a man who believed the world owed him its deference. The judge presiding over this trial was different, not the kind who shook hands at charity galas or dined with donors. Her name was Judge Corliss Freeman, a black woman with sharp features, clear eyes, and a reputation for integrity so unyielding it earned her enemies on both sides of the aisle. She looked at Denmore not as a defendant of prestige, but as a man whose influence had finally met its boundary. "We begin proceedings in the matter of the United States versus Charles Denmore," she said, voice steady and piercing. "The defendant is charged with conspiracy to commit bribery, obstruction of justice, racketeering, and unlawful interference with a federal investigation." The courtroom went still. No cameras were allowed inside, but that didn't stop thousands from following online. Hashtags surged again. Live streams broke records. People across the country, many of them victims of similar injustices, were watching, hoping, praying that this time, money wouldn't win. Jamal sat on his couch, remote in hand, daughter beside him, watching the coverage on a muted screen. He hadn't planned to be glued to it, but each new update pulled him deeper. His freedom was no longer the story. This was bigger. This was the monster behind the curtain, the architect of his pain, now finally being forced to answer for what he'd done. Andre walked in with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Jamal, eyes fixed on the scrolling news ticker beneath the live stream. "You think they'll get him?" Andre asked. Jamal exhaled slowly, took a sip, then nodded. "I think they already have. He just doesn't know it yet." Inside the courtroom, the prosecution's first witness was Lydia Palmer. She walked to the stand in a tailored black blazer, shoulders square, eyes forward. Her voice, though calm, carried a quiet fire, the voice of a woman who had found her courage in the midst of fear and decided never to bury it again. They asked about her job, about her relationship with Denmore, about the night she recorded the conversation. "He told me to make sure the payment was handled discreetly," she said, looking at the jury. "He laughed. Told me the judge would take care of everything, like he always did." "Was there any indication this had happened before?" Lydia hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. I overheard several conversations. There were patterns, names that came up repeatedly. He kept folders locked in a drawer with initials, photos, transaction details. Did you take copies?" "I took what I could without being noticed. But yes, I have documents, bank statements, and dates." The defense tried to rattle her. They called her bitter, suggested she was disgruntled after being fired, implied she was part of a vendetta. But Lydia didn't break. "I didn't come here to be believed," she said at one point. "I came here because the truth doesn't stop being true just because someone with power says it's inconvenient." The second day brought forward an avalanche of evidence, leaked financial reports, cross-checked metadata, anonymous tips from whistleblowers who, inspired by Lydia's courage, came forward with their own stories. They spoke of slumlord practices, illegal evictions, falsified reports submitted to city housing boards, and a long list of transactions traced back to offshore accounts with Denmore's signature. Each witness, each document, each recorded call chipped away at Denmore's fortress until it looked less like an empire and more like a graveyard of secrets he could no longer bury. His defense scrambled to adjust. They argued that Denmore was unaware of his staff's dealings, that he never explicitly authorized any bribes, that he was the victim of internal sabotage. But the jury saw through it, and so did the people. Back home, Jamal stood at his kitchen sink washing dishes, when his phone buzzed. A message. A known number. One line. "Thank you for surviving long enough to fight back." He read it twice, then smiled faintly. Someone out there had watched, listened, remembered. He thought about all the nights he spent on the floor of that cold cell, replaying the trial in his mind, wondering if anyone cared. And now, a stranger's text reminded him that his story had become something bigger than pain. It had become proof. Proof that survival can be resistance. Proof that injustice, once named, cannot hide behind titles or money forever. The final witness was a man named Raymond Epps, a former maintenance worker at one of Denmore's properties who had been fired after refusing to falsify a fire code inspection report. He had nothing to gain from testifying, but he came anyway. "I saw what they did to people like me," he told the jury. "Poor folks, black folks, immigrants. If you didn't play along, they made sure you couldn't live. Rent would double, lights would go out, apartments would flood, and they'd blame you for it." "And why are you here today?" the prosecutor asked. "Because silence didn't protect me then, and it won't protect me now." In closing arguments, the prosecution didn't speak about money, or technicalities, or legal theory. They spoke about people. Every institution is only as strong as the values of the people inside it. Charles Denmore chose to rot those values for profit. He didn't just exploit the law. He used it as a weapon, turning a system meant to protect the vulnerable into a marketplace where justice was auctioned to the highest bidder. They turned to the jury. Don't let wealth erase accountability. Don't let silence become complicity. Let this verdict say what the people have already known, that power without conscience is not power at all. It's tyranny. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. The foreperson stood, voice unwavering. We, the jury, find the defendant, Charles Denmore, guilty on all counts. Gasps, then cheers erupted from the gallery. Denmore didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He simply stared forward, lips pressed together, eyes hollow. For the first time in his life, he faced a sentence he couldn't buy his way out of. Outside, the crowd erupted. People hugged strangers. Some wept. Others stood quietly, soaking in the moment that justice had finally, truly, arrived. Inside her small apartment, Lydia closed her laptop, leaned back on the couch, and exhaled. A smile played on her lips, not triumphant, but peaceful. In the Rhodes household, Jamal picked up his daughter and held her high in the air. "Daddy," she said, giggling, "you look happy." He smiled, heartful. "I am," he said softly, "because today, the giant fell." The city moved on, but not everyone could. With Charles Denmore convicted and sentenced to 32 years without parole, the headlines began to fade. News anchors turned their attention to newer scandals, fresher crises, and celebrity missteps that commanded more ratings. The courthouse steps, once filled with protesters and cameras, now echoed with footsteps of routine. For many it was over. But for Jamal Rhodes, it was only the beginning. The night after Denmore was sentenced, Jamal stood in the hallway of his mother's home, staring at a narrow filing cabinet that had sat untouched for years. Inside were documents from the community mentoring program he ran before his arrest, photos of youth group field trips, volunteer applications, and contact sheets filled with names of kids, many of whom had vanished from the program after his trial. Some had moved away, some had dropped out, but others, he now feared, had ended up swallowed by the same system that nearly crushed him. He pulled the cabinet open and began thumbing through folders, his hands trembling slightly. "Who are you looking for?" Andre asked, stepping into the room with a bowl of cereal in hand, leaning casually against the doorframe. "I'm not sure," Jamal said, eyes scanning a list of names. "But I think I owe it to them to find out." Andre nodded slowly, then walked over and placed his cereal on the desk. "Then let's start tonight." They began with the name of a boy Jamal remembered vividly, Tyrese Holloway, 15, quiet but sharp, always sketching something in his notebook during youth group meetings. His mother used to come by after work to pick him up, always tired, but always proud. Jamal hadn't seen or heard from Tyrese since the night police knocked on his apartment door. They searched online databases, public records, social media. Nothing turned up for a long time. No Facebook, no Instagram, no LinkedIn. Then, a late-night post from a community page led them to a devastating truth. Tyrese had been arrested at 16 for breaking into an abandoned warehouse. No priors, no weapons, no injury. Still, he was sentenced to 7 years. The judge who presided over his case? Harold Whitmore. Jamal leaned back in his chair, eyes closing, jaw tight. Andre spoke softly. "He was just a kid." Jamal whispered, "And I wasn't the only one." They dug deeper. Maria Solano, 17, former class valedictorian, scholarship student, arrested for possession of a small amount of marijuana on school grounds. Her lawyer pushed for diversion. The judge insisted on a year in juvenile detention. Isaiah Bell, 19, pulled over for a broken taillight. Officers claimed he resisted. No body cam footage. Found guilty of assaulting an officer, sentenced to 5 years without parole. Whitmore's name appeared again. And again. And again. The deeper they looked, the more stories they found. Young men and women from low-income neighborhoods, disproportionately Black and Latino, sentenced harshly, consistently denied alternatives, refused leniency. Names lost in the endless paperwork of a machine that ran on pain. By the end of the week, Jamal and Andre had built a list of 43 individuals whose lives had been directly affected by Whitmore's courtroom. But they weren't just building a list. They were building a case. They reached out to a civil rights organization called Justice Unshackled, who had helped overturn wrongful convictions across the country. Within days, an investigative team was dispatched to South Heights. Lawyers, social workers, journalists, all digging through records, knocking on doors, interviewing families, visiting prisons. One of the interviews broke Jamal in half. A woman named Delilah Carter stood in the doorway of a cramped apartment, her hair tied back with a rag, her voice weary from years of grief. "My son, he made a mistake," she said. "He stole a jacket from a department store. Said he needed one for a job interview. He was 17. The judge made an example out of him. 5 years." Her voice cracked. "First week in there, he got jumped. Broke his jaw. He's never been the same. And nobody cared." She looked at Jamal, eyes red. "You know what it feels like to lose your baby before they even bury him?" Jamal lowered his head, tears burning in his eyes. "I do," he said. "I do now." Within a month, Justice Unshackled filed a formal motion with the Department of Justice to conduct a full judicial review of every case tried by Whitmore between 2006 and 2022. They called it the Echo Docket, a haunting name for a haunting pattern. Jamal and Lydia Palmer were asked to testify before the commission. Lydia agreed immediately. Jamal hesitated not because he was afraid, but because he knew what it meant. To relive it. To say it all again. To open old wounds so others could begin healing. But he did it. They both did. Standing in a packed auditorium turned hearing room, they spoke with the clarity of people who had nothing left to lose and everything left to give. Lydia shared the cold facts, the ledgers, the memos, the phone calls. Jamal shared the cost, the time stolen, the people broken, the trust lost. By the time they finished, the room was silent, heavy with the weight of realization. This wasn't just about corruption. It was about an entire generation scarred by the decisions of a man who viewed justice as a transaction. In the weeks that followed, old case files were reopened. Convictions were re-evaluated. Several individuals were released. Others were granted new trials. Families who hadn't seen hope in years were suddenly visited by lawyers with apologies and promises. Jamal received letters. Dozens of them. Some were from men he had never met. Others were from mothers, sisters, cousins. "You gave us a second chance. I didn't think anyone would ever listen. Your pain became our proof." One letter, handwritten on lined notebook paper, came from a man named Aaron Dorsey. He had been sentenced at 18 for a crime he didn't commit, another Whitmore case. He had heard Jamal's story on a prison radio. "I cried that night. Not because I was sad, but because for the first time, I felt seen. I hope one day I can tell my story like you did. Thank you for not disappearing." Jamal read it twice, folded it, and slid it into his pocket. But not every name had a happy ending. Some of the people they found had already died in custody, stabbed in fights, untreated illnesses, suicide. Names that could no longer speak for themselves. Those names haunted Jamal. He wrote each one on a piece of paper and taped them on his wall, a personal memorial to lives cut short by a system that judged them too quickly and forgave itself too easily. One evening, while walking with his daughter through the park, Jamal looked up at the sky and wondered how many others were still buried in silence. How many names were buried in dusty archives, how many stories never told, how many lives broken before they had the chance to begin. His daughter ran ahead, laughing, arms wide like wings, and he watched her with a soft smile. "Daddy," she called back. "You coming?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, baby. I'm coming." The rain came down soft that morning, more like a hush than a storm, as if the heavens were whispering something over a city still waking up to its own reflection. Inside the small church on 7th and Holman, the pews filled one by one, not with congregants seeking a sermon, but with survivors seeking one another. They weren't here for praise songs or preaching. They were here for remembrance. Justice Unshackled had organized it, a gathering they called the Roll Call of the Silenced. Dozens of names, printed on white banners and strung across the walls, fluttered gently as the doors opened. Each name belonged to someone sentenced under Judge Harold Whitmore, each name a life altered, stolen, or scarred. Some of those people were now free. Others were still behind bars. A few were gone, their voices reduced to past tense, their stories told only by those who loved them enough to carry the burden of memory. Jamal Rhodes sat near the back, head bowed, suit pressed, hands folded tightly in his lap. His daughter sat beside him, her small hand resting inside his, her curiosity written across her face. She didn't fully understand what all of this meant, not yet, but she understood that her father was part of something big, something sad, something brave. The organizer stepped up to the mic. "Today," she began, "we say the names they tried to bury." The room fell still. She began to read. One by one, name after name, pain after pain. Aaron Dorsey. Maria Solano. Isaiah Bell. Deshaun Craig. Lena Ortiz. Tyrese Holloway. A low hum of grief filled the air, not loud, but steady, like a heartbeat holding everyone together. Some wept. Some clenched their fists. Others stared straight ahead, eyes glassy, lips trembling. Jamal stood slowly when he heard Tyrese's name, the image of the quiet boy with the sketchpad flashing in his mind. That kid didn't deserve a cage. He deserved a scholarship. A future. He deserved to be standing here, not remembered from behind a banner. When the roll call ended, the room held silence like a secret. Then the organizer stepped back up. "Today," she said, her voice cracking slightly, "we reclaim their stories. Because the system doesn't get the last word. We do." After the ceremony, a small group gathered outside beneath gray skies and rustling trees. Jamal found himself surrounded by people who had lived different versions of his pain. A woman in her 60s told him about her son who had been sentenced at 17 and died in prison before turning 20. A young man with a stutter spoke of being framed for theft, spending 4 years inside, and coming out to a world that looked at him like he was still wearing the uniform. They all had different faces, different voices, but one truth connected them. They had been broken by something that was never meant to protect them. And they had survived. Jamal listened more than he spoke, absorbing the weight of what had been done to all of them. Not just individually, but collectively. This wasn't the story of one man. This was the story of an entire generation, a community targeted and discarded by a machine dressed in robes and badges. But as he looked around, he also realized something else. They were still here, still breathing, still standing. They were the ones who refused to stay silent. Meanwhile, in a conference room across town, Lydia Palmer faced her own reckoning. She sat at a long table across from a state ethics panel, lawyers on either side of her, cameras recording every moment. She had agreed to testify, again, not just against Denmore and Whitmore, but against the culture that allowed men like them to rise unchecked. She had been subpoenaed after new evidence surfaced, documents she had saved, forgotten about, found buried in a storage drive she thought she'd erased. They were contracts, emails, coded messages that implicated other officials, names that hadn't yet made headlines. And now, the panel wanted answers. "Ms. Palmer," one of them said, adjusting his glasses, "do you believe the corruption you witnessed was systemic?" She didn't flinch. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely." "How high did it go?" "As high as people were willing to look away." "And why didn't you come forward sooner?" She looked at them, eyes unwavering. "Because silence was easier. Until it wasn't." They pressed her with more questions, tried to poke holes, questioned her loyalty, her motives, her timing. But Lydia had grown into her defiance. She had learned the price of withholding truth, and she wasn't about to pay it again. When the session ended, she stepped out into the hallway, her phone buzzing with texts from people she didn't even know, victims, activists, young women thanking her for her courage, older men apologizing for not believing her sooner. She scrolled, overwhelmed, humbled, and deeply aware of the responsibility she now carried. She had been a witness, yes, but she was also becoming something more. A warrior with receipts. That evening, Jamal and Andre sat on the porch with 2 laptops open and a stack of documents between them. They were building something not for themselves, but for those still caught in the system. A database. A digital library of every affected case, every exposed loophole, every released inmate, every piece of evidence they could collect. It would be free, searchable, permanent. A place where no name would be forgotten, where no file could be lost, where no story would fade just because time moved on. "We're gonna call it the witness wall," Andre said, typing code into a window. Jamal nodded, smiling faintly. For those who spoke and those who never got the chance. They worked deep into the night, fueled not by caffeine, but by urgency. The fight wasn't finished. The system had been shaken, but not dismantled. And they knew there were still judges hiding behind their titles, still deals made in the dark, still dockets filled with lives treated like numbers. But now, there was also light. There were eyes watching. There were people listening. The next morning, Jamal received a letter in the mail. No return address. The handwriting was familiar. Inside was a single sheet of paper. My son's case was reopened. They're releasing him next month. Thank you. You didn't just get justice for yourself. You brought it home for the rest of us. Keep going. No name. Just the truth. He folded the letter slowly, placed it inside his Bible, then looked out the window at the street below. Life was still hard. Bills still piled up. The city still wore its scars. But something had changed. The silence had cracked. The walls had spoken. And now, they could never go quiet again. The day they reopened Jamal Rhodes's case file was the day the city officially admitted it had failed him. Not just once, not in the courtroom alone, but in the years of silence that followed, in the policies that gave unchecked power to men like Whitmore, in the ink of transcripts where objections were denied without cause, where character was questioned because of skin, where the truth was buried under technicalities, and lives were filed away like forgotten paperwork. But now, the file was open again, this time under federal supervision. Jamal stood in the same courthouse, wearing his own clothes, his own name, his own freedom, no chains on his wrists, no guards at his back. The hearing wasn't about reconvicting or resentencing. It was about correction, officially, publicly, and permanently. The courtroom was full, packed with media, civil rights observers, and families of other wrongfully convicted men and women. Lydia sat near the front, beside a woman holding a photograph of her son who had spent 10 years behind bars for a crime committed by someone with a badge. Judge Corliss Freeman presided again, her presence firm, her expression unreadable. She didn't allow unnecessary speeches, didn't entertain political theater. She believed justice was not in words, but in record. This hearing, she began, is to correct the judicial record regarding the wrongful conviction of Mr. Jamal Rhodes, previously sentenced by former Judge Harold Whitmore. The court recognizes the violation of due process, the concealment of judicial misconduct, and the proven bribery that directly influenced the outcome of Mr. Rhodes's trial. She turned toward Jamal, her eyes meeting his. Mr. Rhodes, on behalf of the judicial system, I apologize. The words hung in the air, heavy and unfamiliar. The courtroom didn't erupt in applause, it didn't shout in celebration, because apology wasn't triumph, it was recognition. It was the least the system could give after taking so much. Jamal nodded once, then rose to his feet, standing tall as the judge read the formal vacator into the record. His name, once associated with mugshots, arrest warrants, and cold case files, now rang out in the courtroom as a symbol not of guilt, but of survival, of resilience, of resistance. When it was done, Andre stood and clapped slowly. Others joined, not because it erased what had happened, but because it mattered. It mattered that the truth had finally been spoken where lies once ruled. Outside, reporters swarmed, microphones extended, flashes clicking like lightning. What does this mean for you, Mr. Rhodes? One asked. It means I can finally walk with my head high, Jamal replied. It means my daughter won't grow up thinking her father was a criminal when all I did was survive a lie. Do you feel vindicated? He paused, then shook his head gently. I feel tired, he said. But I'm not done. Back at home, Jamal sat on the floor of his daughter's room, reading her a bedtime story. She curled up against his arm, yawning halfway through the page. He paused, brushing her curls back from her forehead. Daddy, she whispered. Yeah, baby. Why did those people say you did something bad? He swallowed hard, placing the book on the floor. Because sometimes, he said slowly, people with power lie when they're scared of the truth. And sometimes, they think if they lie loud enough, long enough, they'll win. Did they win? He smiled softly. Not this time. She nodded once, then drifted to sleep, her breath slow, her trust whole again. Meanwhile, Lydia met with federal investigators regarding the files she'd helped expose, folders that listed not just bribes, but names of other judges, corporate allies, and even law enforcement officers who had benefited from Denmore's influence. Some were minor, a favor here, a donation there, but others were staggering. An officer who had coerced false testimony in exchange for a promotion. A councilman who had greenlit eviction orders on families who were fighting Denmore in civil court. A law clerk who had been paid off to lose certain motions before they reached the judge's desk. Each name led to another. Each case reopened another wound. The investigators worked day and night, trying to keep up. The Department of Justice launched a formal task force. New whistleblower protections were announced. The governor even signed an emergency reform bill aimed at increasing transparency in judicial appointments and court rulings. But none of it brought back lost time. None of it reversed the deaths. None of it rewrote the trauma etched into the lives of those still trying to heal. Which is why Jamal and Andre pressed on. The Witness Wall project had grown faster than anyone expected. What started as a modest database was now a full digital platform with searchable court documents, recorded testimonies, timelines, and even a podcast featuring stories from exonerees and advocates. Jamal hosted it himself, voice calm but charged, inviting survivors to share their stories in their own words. The podcast quickly climbed the charts. Not because it was produced by a media company or sponsored by corporations, but because it was raw, real, and necessary. In one episode, a man named Kareem Johnson described how he learned to read in prison using legal books because he didn't trust his own public defender to explain the charges. In another, a woman named Patrice detailed how her brother was sentenced based on a confession he never gave, signed under duress, alone, 17, with no parent present. Each story added another line to the ledger of injustice, another voice to the record that had once erased them. One afternoon, Jamal received a letter from a district judge in a neighboring county. "Mr. Rhodes, your story changed the way I approach my courtroom. I now read every case with a deeper sense of humility. I will never again assume that wearing a robe makes me immune to failure. Thank you for reminding us what justice is supposed to mean." He showed the letter to Andre, who just shook his head, laughing. "You got judges writing thank you notes now," he said. "You might be dangerous, man." Jamal smiled. "Good," he said. "They should be nervous." But it wasn't all praise. There were threats, emails filled with slurs, letters accusing him of stirring trouble, of disrespecting the law, of making things worse. And still, Jamal didn't stop. Because he understood now that silence was the most dangerous force of all. Not anger, not hate, silence. The ability to look away. To forget, to move on. And he refused to be part of that. On the anniversary of his release, Jamal held a candlelight vigil on the courthouse steps. No microphones. No speeches. Just names read aloud. One by one. 43 in total. For those still incarcerated. For those lost. For those still waiting. Each name was followed by silence. And in that silence, a kind of reverence, not just for the suffering, but for the strength it took to speak, to remember, to keep walking forward with no promise that anyone would follow. But they did follow. Because when one man refuses to forget, the world begins to remember. The wind was warm that evening, brushing against the courthouse steps as if even the air had come to witness what justice, at long last, looked like. A bronze plaque had just been mounted on the outer wall, polished and gleaming under the setting sun. It wasn't large or flashy, but its words carried a quiet weight that silenced the crowd gathered before it. Dedicated to the lives affected by judicial misconduct. To the silenced, the wrongfully convicted, the unheard, you were always more than a case number. May your stories never be buried again. Jamal stood among them, hands in his pockets, eyes locked on the inscription. His daughter sat on his shoulders, clapping along with the others as a small choir sang softly behind them, voices floating over the street like incense. It had been 1 year since Denmore's conviction. 1 year since Judge Whitmore was sentenced. 1 year since Jamal's record was officially cleared. But time hadn't dulled the urgency. If anything, it had sharpened it. In that year, 17 more wrongful convictions had been overturned, thanks to the witness wall and the tireless volunteers working around it. 4 corrupt officials had been indicted. New legislation had been passed, requiring independent oversight in sentencing procedures for nonviolent offenses. And schools across the city had added a new civic studies module titled Justice, Power, and the People. Change hadn't come easy, and it certainly hadn't come perfectly. But it had come, one truth at a time, one voice at a time, one refusal to stay silent at a time. Jamal never saw himself as a hero. Even now, as people stopped him on the street, thanking him, asking for advice, sharing stories about cousins and brothers and daughters, he still thought of himself as a survivor, nothing more, nothing less. But survival, he'd come to understand, wasn't passive. It was resistance. It was endurance. It was choosing, every day, not to disappear. So when the mayor's office reached out and asked him to speak at the unveiling of the plaque, he said yes, not because he wanted to be seen, but because he wanted the truth to be heard one more time, on the very steps where it was once denied. He stepped up to the podium, the same courthouse behind him that once swallowed his name into a conviction, now standing behind him as a monument to accountability. He took a breath, let the crowd settle, then spoke. "I'm not here today because I was saved. I'm here because I refuse to be forgotten." Heads nodded. Some hands clutched candles. Others wiped away tears. For too long, justice was something only the powerful could afford. For too long, the rest of us were told to trust a system that didn't trust us back. I was convicted without evidence. Sentenced without cause. Forgotten without consequence. He looked down at his daughter in the crowd, her eyes wide, proud, innocent. "But I'm standing here now because people refuse to stay quiet. Because someone recorded the truth. Because someone told the truth. Because someone believed in it enough to fight for it, even when it didn't fight for them." He let the words hang for a moment, let them settle. This plaque isn't about me. It's not even just about those whose names are written in our records. It's about those who never made it back. The ones we didn't get to save. The ones who died with their innocence still tangled in red tape. His voice broke, just slightly, but he didn't stop. "So let this be our vow, not just to remember, but to act. Not just to be outraged, but to organize. Not just to post and move on, but to push, to question, to demand more from the systems that serve us." He stepped away from the mic slowly, but the applause rose like thunder behind him. Not wild, not frenzied, but full of purpose, full of meaning, full of the collective breath of people who had waited too long to exhale. Later that night, Jamal sat alone on the rooftop of his apartment building, city lights blinking like stars below. Lydia joined him, quietly handing him a thermos of coffee, her presence calm as always. "You think it'll last?" she asked, gazing out at the skyline. Jamal considered the question, then nodded. "Not by accident," he said. "But yes, if we keep choosing it." Lydia smiled faintly. "Justice isn't a moment. It's a muscle." He looked at her, then at the city they had helped change. "Then we better keep it flexed." They sat in silence, two people bound not by what had happened to them, but by what they refused to let happen to others. Across town, in homes big and small, families gathered around glowing screens, watching Jamal's speech as it replayed on local news and social media. In barbershops, in laundromats, in church halls and classrooms, people talked, not just about one man's redemption, but about what it meant for all of them. About how systems are built, how they break, and how people, regular, flawed, untrained people, can fix what was designed to stay broken. The conversation had started, and it wasn't going anywhere. If you made it to this point, you know this story wasn't just about a courtroom, a judge, or even a corrupt billionaire. It was about how power moves in the shadows, and how truth can find its way into the light when ordinary people choose to do the extraordinary. Now it's your turn. If you believe stories like Jamal's matter, if you believe in accountability, in justice, in amplifying voices the system tried to silence, then don't let this story end here. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes the world can change, one truth at a time. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Not just your reactions, but your reflections. What does justice mean to you? Who else do you think needs to be heard? What role can you play? Because the legacy of truth isn't built by one voice alone. It's built by all of us, together.